But let's start with the traditions. And let's start from 100,000 feet up in the air. Enforcement does not work. Only embracement works. Alcoholics, we know, we tend to have a problem with authority. It seems to not make you an alcoholic, but it's one of those things where it seems it's common. We all know that what makes you an alcoholic is the allergy and the mental obsession. That's what makes you an alcoholic. It seems that a lot of people with the allergy and the obsession have a tendency to have a problem with authority. So that's just my unscientific observation of myself and many others over the years in service. It's only by embracing the traditions and other people seeing that they'll want to do the same. Scolding and humiliating and that stuff, it usually does not work. There is a part, I'm not going to debate the warranties today. There is a part in the warranties where you could say, it's said to use all available resources when something is that bad. But for the most part, it's not. There are a couple of things that I've noticed. A lot of times, the behavior reacting to a so-called traditions problem is worse than the behavior that is being corrected. That does not help. Raising your voice, rolling your eyes, being condescending, none of that helps. If I could say one thing that I personally believe, because I do believe that the last 2 years of COVID, there is a renaissance with the traditions and the concepts. Like, more people are aware of them today. But what I would say is, here's my view when people ask me, how can I make it better? Whether it's your group, your area, the people you sponsor, whoever. Well, if you happen to be a Joe and Charlie fan, and you've ever listened to those tapes, one of the things you'll hear them talk about when you're going to take someone through the big book is asking that person, are they willing to go to any lengths? It's a common question. If someone wants you to take time out of your life to take them through the program of recovery, it's a fair question to ask that person. Are they willing to go to any lengths? But when we're dealing with newcomers, sometimes we have to explain things clearly. Like, your definition of any lengths might be much different than their definition of any lengths. It happens. There's one thing that I would suggest defining. If you're willing to take the time to take the person through the 12 steps in whatever edition of the big book you're using. So if it's the first 110 or the first 130, wherever, from the start of the book through the preface and forwards, through the doctor's opinion, Bill's story, all the way up to working with others, where step 12 is talked about. If you're going to take the time to take someone through that, I think the question to ask them is, when I am done taking you through the big book, are you going to be willing to go through the 12 traditions? Because a lot of times we just get people on fire with First Legacy recovery. And we have 3 legacies. We have unity, recovery, and service. And what happens when you send someone on fire with no knowledge of the traditions, who just went through the big book? Well, you know how that person is. They're a complete nightmare. You run into the newcomer who just went through the steps and had a spiritual experience. They want to tell the whole world about it. They want to tell everybody else in AA they're doing it wrong. They want to tell everybody they need to go to their home group. and they have no experience with the traditions. It's kind of like polluting the rest of AA. So I believe the best thing to do is to define that. And as soon as you're done taking someone through the tradition, through the big book, to take them through the traditions. Now, that doesn't mean don't mention the traditions until you're done going through the big book. I just want to make that clear. Oftentimes, and a lot of times we don't realize this, oftentimes we talk about the traditions with newcomers before the steps. We just don't use the word tradition. But those are common newcomer conversations. A new person comes to their first, second, or third AA meeting. Maybe they talk to you after the meeting in the parking lot, in the back of the room. And what are some of the common questions? Do I got to believe in God? No. Do I have to believe in the God of the church that your meeting meets in? No. How much does it cost to belong here? Do I have to put money in that basket? No. No, you don't. Who's the leader? Who's in charge here? All those questions are traditions because we have common answers. Oh, no, we let you pick your own higher power. No, we're just self-supporting. If you have money, we ask you to contribute because we're self-supporting and don't take other people's money. But we don't go into a long, drawn-out explanation of, oh, that's tradition 7, paragraph 6 in the 12 and 12. No, we just say, we give the answer. Because one of the most important things for a sponsor to do in Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, everyone knows I love Joe and Charlie. I love Don P. And I love Joe H. And unfortunately, they're all passed away. But that group of people in the 80s and the 90s, they were on fire with the big book. Joe H., Don P., Joe and Charlie. They were all over, always at conferences. And so everyone knows, you know, I love the big book. There are certain things about big book workshops, though, that drive me crazy when they are historically not accurate. That drives me crazy. When people say things like, I want the program the first 100 had. Well, I would be the person to ask, which one of the first 100? Because that's a dangerous statement. You want one of the ones who stayed permanently sober until the first edition was printed in April of 1939? Or you want one of the people who drank themselves to death in 1938? Like, which one of the first 100? I also am not a big fan of when people say the only job a sponsor has is to take someone through the steps. That's just simply not true. One of the biggest responsibilities a sponsor has is to let a newcomer know what AA is and what AA isn't. Those two questions alone in today's world, especially what AA isn't. Take someone who's 5 days sober, living in a recovery house. They think AA and the recovery house are the same thing. They think the recovery house is just some house that AA owns where we warehouse newcomers in until they can pay their own bills and get on their feet. There are so many questions for a sponsor to help a newcomer with. To say that we're only going to take them through the steps, here's where I'll make a disclaimer. If all you're trying to do is give someone first legacy recovery, and all you're trying to do is make them a member of the recovery community and give them a spiritual experience, I guess that's fine. But if there's anything controversial, I'll say today it's probably this. And believe me, I have lost a lot of friends over this. There is a big difference between the recovery community and the spiritual society of Alcoholics in Action called Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, you can be in both, but just because you're in the recovery community does not mean you are a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And people get mad sometimes when I say that. Particularly people who are very in the conference kind of circuit. And I don't mean the speakers only. I mean people who go to a lot of conferences. I mean people who put on the conferences. I mean all of those people. They get a little upset when I talk about this topic. Because even though it's not in our literature, one of our biggest character defects is people pleasing. People pleasing is another thing. It doesn't make you an alcoholic, but it seems to be common amongst us alcoholics. The recovery community for money has invaded the AA world. Whether people want to admit that or not is not my problem. But we have a lot of influential speakers who are paid in the recovery community. Now, that doesn't make them bad. Some of them are good friends of mine. The place where it hurts newcomers is when people don't leave that outside of AA. I'll tell you once, and I'll never mention it again, just as an example. I'm an executive in the insurance industry. That has nothing to do with AA. Zero. I don't care if you've been a counselor for 30 years. That has nothing to do with AA. It has nothing. And me telling you about insurance for 15 minutes while I'm telling my story is as disrespectful as somebody else talking about their paid recovery from an AA podium. And that's why I stress that the newcomer needs to know what is AA and what's not AA. And the traditions were written so that we could all work together. So let's quickly go through traditions 1 through 4. Tradition 1 is easy. It's basically the only tradition we have. The other 11 are just a way to get there and stay there. AA unity is the single most important tradition out there. I will say it this strongly. I don't care if you don't like the new preamble that was approved at the last General Service Conference. You know why? Because I think AA unity is more important than mine or any other individual's comment. Now, if you told me you wanted to send in an agenda item or write an appeal, I would say that's great. But until then, we have a new preamble. I don't like the blue card. Anyone who knows me knows I hate the blue card for open meetings. And I tell the story all the time. I'll be sitting minding my own business at a meeting, like I'm there early, I'm sitting there, probably have a million things going on. It seems to always be a lunchtime meeting when it happens. And you know that look when the chairperson gets up from the table right before the meeting and they have 3 pieces of laminated paper in their hands. And one is usually the blue card and one is how it works and one might be the preamble. And I hate when I see the person walking towards me with the blue card because I know what they're going to ask me. Hey, would you please read this? What's your name? And what I want to say is, no, I hate that, but I don't say that. I just say I'd be glad to read it. And I read the words that are on the blue card. I don't add the words that I think should be there. Because AA unity is more important than anything else. It, at the end of the day, is all we have. That's why when we say in tradition 1, in the first paragraph of the 12 and 12, neither money nor conformity define an AA member. Those are strong words. Conformity, you can look it up in the dictionary. Whatever your first or second language is, doesn't matter to me. Conformity is a strong word. I will let people know that the blue card is what defines open and closed meetings, and I'll get into that later on in the traditions. But we have a blue card in the US and Canada, and it says this is an open meeting, this is a closed meeting. We have a green card for the 7th tradition. We have a yellow card for safety. But at the end of the day, tradition 1, I'm going to read the long form of it just for anyone here who's maybe never heard it. Each member of Alcoholics Anonymous is a small part of a great whole. AA must continue to live, or most of us will surely die. Hence, our common welfare comes first, but individual welfare close afterwards. That is a strong statement for alcoholics, that we're a small part of a great whole. Now, you'll hear other people say, once you've been through the big book and you've had a spiritual experience, you don't need meetings. That is so scary to me. I think you don't need meetings because you should have a home group. That's why I think you don't need meetings. But I'm not anti-meeting. I'm just very pro home group. But it says AA must continue to live, or most of us will surely die. So our literature doesn't say as long as you have a spiritual experience, everything's going to be okay. Our literature says AA needs to be here, or most of us are going to die eventually. Tradition 2, from a high level, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as we express himself in our group conscience. When you read AA Comes of Age, and if you read the 12 and 12, you will see the stories that is hard for sometimes old timers to accept. And that is the very fundamental principle in AA, that the group always knows better. Always. It knows better than the oldest old timer. It knows better than the newest newcomer. The group always knows better. Now, I don't have a lot of time because we're quickly going through these, but here's what I want to tell you. Go to AA.org and get a PDF of the AA group pamphlet, which is like the owner's manual of Alcoholics Anonymous. That pamphlet is amazing. Because when it says for our purpose, there's but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience, an informed group conscience, not a runaway, hasty majority decision, not something we just decided to do today, but an informed group conscience where we take the time to make sure everybody has the right information, to make sure we have had a lot of discussion time. That's an informed group conscience. But it takes a lot of experience in AA to really realize that it's easy to support a group conscience that you're in favor of. The spiritual lesson from God that is tied to the steps in your personal life is how much can you support a group conscience that you are not in favor of? If you're really looking at your own spiritual well-being and condition, if I would explain it in the US, every meeting room has an exit sign above the door or doors. It's the law in the US. You got to have an exit sign. And I always say that exit sign is more important than any slogan on the wall. Because when you leave a group conscience meeting and you walk out under that exit sign, 99.9% of the time, your only job is to carry out that group conscience. And the spiritual test is to even work harder at it when you were against it. That's the true spiritual test tied to the steps. Tradition 3, what I say here, if you've never been to a tradition study, could be a little controversial. I understand that. If you don't like something I've said, or if you don't agree with it, please write me or talk to your sponsor, or because I would tell you that most of the time when I hear people talk about tradition 3, they right away go to talk about the D word, the drug word. And I hear a lot about diversity and inclusion in Alcoholics Anonymous. Tradition 3 was 100 years before its time. Don't let anyone convince you, because there's a lot of people out there saying some stuff that it's hard for me to hear. There's a lot of people out there who are not celebrating that AA was 100 years ahead of the times when it comes to inclusiveness. Tradition 3 is the great inclusive tradition. See, we don't have any disqualifiers for AA membership. I'll read the long form. Our membership ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism. Hence, we may refuse none who wish to recover, nor ought AA membership ever depend upon money or conformity. Any 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered together for sobriety may call themselves an AA group, provided that as a group, they have no other affiliation. That statement, the first sentence, it's very strong. Our membership ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism. So when you want to hear people argue the desire to stop drinking, the short form, just go to the last sentence or paragraph in the 12 and 12 on Tradition 3. Because people want to say anybody's a member of Alcoholics Anonymous if they say they are. That is not what our literature says. Our literature says any alcoholic is a member when they say they are. That's right from the 12 and 12. So if an alcoholic has a desire to stop drinking, then fine, they can call themselves a member. But this tradition, 100 years ahead of it, maybe more than the rest of the world. We only have a qualifier, we have no disqualifiers. There are 61 people in this meeting right now. I am going to guess that there are some people here who qualify or are members of other 12-step fellowships. Beyond that, I'm going to guess that there are some people here who have some other problems. Otherwise, this is the first meeting I've ever been in the history of doing workshops where everybody, alcoholism is their only problem. That's it. That's the only problem they have in life. But that's why the tradition is a qualifier and not a disqualifier. Now, I'm getting a little excited because November 4th is approaching. And for those that have heard me speak before, you might know that that means that I will see Metallica on November 4th, right? And one of the things I always say is I quote their song, "Nothing else matters." The only thing that matters about Tradition 3 membership is that you are an alcoholic. We'll get to the rest of it in Tradition 5. But that you're an alcoholic. It doesn't matter if you're an alcoholic in a million other things. Where we've caused trouble inside AA is by believing that because we have had a spiritual experience in AA, we can help other people. Again, the invasion of that outside recovery world into AA, that it's all the same. That's not what our book says. I do not believe in personal humiliation in a meeting. But again, I go back to a sponsor's job. What is AA and what isn't AA? How do you identify an AA? Well, I say I'm Billy and I'm an alcoholic. It took me a long time to really understand what that meant when I said I was an alcoholic. I thought that was just something I said to have to speak in a meeting. But whatever other problems or issues I may have, they have nothing to do with that AA membership or meeting. In AA, I'm one amongst many. I'm just simply an alcoholic. Tradition 4, I'm going to read it, the long form. With respect to its own affairs, each AA group should be responsible to no other authority than its own conscience. But when its plans concern the welfare of neighboring groups also, the groups ought to be consulted. And no group, regional committee, or individual should ever take any action that might greatly affect AA as a whole without conferring with the trustees of the General Service Board. On such issues, our common welfare is paramount. I'll throw out a couple of simple rules I have about this tradition. First one is, a lot of people know it. If you hear somebody quote Tradition 4 or the word autonomy, it usually means they're about to back a tractor up over about 5 other traditions. At least 1 or 2, but usually 5. And Tradition 4 is not about a veto power over any of the other 11. There's a great line in the Traditions Illustrated. It applies to local matters. It applies to customs, not traditions. Do you like cake instead of cupcakes? Do you like Earl Grey or English breakfast tea at your meeting? You going to have decaf or just regular coffee? You start at 8 o'clock or 6 o'clock? Are you a 1 hour or an hour and a half meeting? Are you an open meeting or a closed meeting? Are you a speaker meeting or a big book study meeting or a 12 and 12 study meeting? Those are all local questions. Autonomy applies to anything that falls within the group voting on its authority. So anything your group can change all on its own. But groups don't have the right to change the steps or the preamble or any of our literature. That's not a local matter. That group conscience belongs to another service body inside AA. But this autonomy word gets thrown around and used to cause so much damage. We don't get to change the membership rules. Please, especially next week, we're going to talk about Tradition 5. Please get a copy of the AA group pamphlet. Some countries have adopted it, some have not. Some have their own version. But as far as studying, I don't think there's anything wrong with the AA group pamphlet. It's basic AA principles. Now, autonomy is where I disagree with some other trusted servants about different countries. See, I believe that the traditions apply everywhere in God's world, not just in the borders of the country I live in or the two countries that might structure the US and Canada. I believe they apply everywhere. So I don't think religion has any place inside Alcoholics Anonymous. I think the traditions are very clear on that. Next week when we talk about Tradition 5, we'll really go into open and closed meetings and AA's primary purpose. But I'm going to stop there. And from 100,000 feet, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the concepts. First of all, they were published in 1961. Sometimes we say we're a 3 Legacy AA member. What does that mean? It means that us in our groups, we believe in all 3 legacies. Some people say 36 spiritual principles, the 12 steps, the 12 traditions, and the 12 concepts. There are some that believe we have 24 spiritual principles and the concepts just expanded on the 24 we already had it. I'm not into debating any of that. It all sounds fine to me, actually. If you think it's 24 and expanded in the concepts, or if you think we have 36 spiritual principles, I respect both. What I don't believe in is these one words we've applied to each step or each tradition or each concept. When I'm sitting in a meeting and somebody says, well, the principle behind that step or tradition, well, that's because they've read it off of some drunk junk calendar that somebody who makes money making calendars put a word next to a step or a tradition or a concept. It's nowhere in AA literature. It's somebody's personal opinion that looked good on a refrigerator magnet, so they sold a lot of them. But it has nothing to do with AA literature. You can divide the concepts into 4 parts. Concepts 1 through 5, concepts 6, 7, and 8, concepts 9, 10, and 11, and concept 12. Concepts 1 to 5 are basically the Bill of Rights of AA. That's where it is spelled out, the rights that every AA group has. Concepts 6, 7, and 8 talk about the relationship between the General Service Conference and the Board of Trustees. And we'll get into that in detail. Concepts 9, 10, and 11 talk about mostly how the Board of Trustees carries out its mission. And concept 12 is basically Article 12 of the original conference charter, which we call the 6 warranties. And we'll get into that when we get to concept 12. I want to stress a couple of things. Let me just turn to a page so I can show a diagram. I just want to show this diagram quickly. A lot of you have probably seen it, the good old upside down triangle. This is the US and Canada version, but at the top are the AA groups. And I just want to go to concept 1 for a second, where it says the final responsibility and ultimate authority for AA World Service should always reside in the collective conscience of our fellowship. And then I want to go to sentence 1. The AA groups today hold ultimate responsibility and final authority for our world services. Not the AA members, not people like me who have a million opinions. I happen to be a past trustee and a past delegate, but I get 1 vote. That's it. At my home group, like everyone else. But meetings do not hold the ultimate authority. And it is so important to learn the difference between a meeting and a group. And I'm going to talk about that next week when we get to Tradition 5 and we talk about the AA group pamphlet. But there's a difference between a meeting and a group. It's spelled out inside the AA group pamphlet. A meeting gets together 5 minutes before, reads a couple of things, has a meeting, and they're out of there. There's nothing wrong with that. They're not bad, but that's not an AA home group. An AA home group exists outside the prescribed meeting time. For an AA home group, what happens outside the meeting time makes it a group more than what happens inside the meeting time. The meetings are just part of that group. But is your group connected to your local service structure or your national service structure or your local central office or intergroup or whatever you call it in your country? Is your group doing work in hospitals and institutions and doing public information work and carrying the message outside your group? Do you get together and celebrate and stuff and anniversaries and birthdays? That's what's most important. But AA was left to the groups. And in concept 2, how do the groups carry out that responsibility? How do they do that? Well, they do that by having an active GSR who goes to district or goes to your assembly or whatever you call it in your country and brings it back to the group so that you know what's going on inside AA, and who's participating in electing a delegate that's going to be your voice at the General Service Conference in your country, or if you belong to the United Kingdom General Service Conference structure. That's why electing a GSR is so important. And that's why electing a delegate is so important. But if you don't elect the right GSR, they're not going to elect the right delegate. You're putting all your faith in that delegate that you elect to go to the conference. Concept 3, I'll read it. As a traditional means of creating and maintaining clearly defined working relations between the groups, the conference, and the AA General Service Board, and its several service corporations, staffs, committees, and executives, and thus of ensuring their effective leadership, it is hereby suggested that we endow each of these elements of world service with a traditional right of decision. Your right of decision is your vote at your home group. That's the most important right of decision we never talk about. When I raise my hand to elect the GSR, that's me exercising my right of decision, because after that, the GSR gets to vote at the assembly or the district, not me. We can't elect AA leaders and not let them do certain things. Should I have to call all 93 delegates to file the tax returns for AA World Service? No. I think when I was chair of that board, I just signed them, and that's why I was elected to do that position. But the problem with Concept 3 all over the world is the last two paragraphs in Concept 3, if you have a Concept 3 book in front of you. Is the problems in AA with right of decision come from leaders not being transparent or not being forthcoming or not disclosing decisions timely. What does it say in the book? It says the right of decision should never be made an excuse for failure to render proper reports of all significant actions taken. It should never be used as a reason for constantly exceeding an authority. That's it. We have to have leaders, and those leaders need to be able to make decisions. But when we get into Concept 8, I'm going to really explain what decisions they should be making and not making. They make simple decisions to keep AA going, but not major policy, not major finance decisions. And if they don't disclose decisions quickly and timely, they're not living in the spirit of Concept 3. Concept 4 is very complicated, and I'm just going to give you from 100,000 feet the US and Canada version so that you can apply it to any country that you're in. I will say first that no concept has helped me more in my professional life than this one. But I hate when people talk about the traditions and concepts in their relationships or their work life or whatever, because they never talk about them in AA. If you can't apply them and talk about applying them in AA, don't be doing workshops about applying them elsewhere. But here's the example, and if you have to take notes or you want to write, it'll be simple, but I want to make sure that I explain it because the wording is a little wordy and complicated. Our General Service Conference has about 135 voting members. Start with that number. We have 93 area delegates. Those are the delegates directly voted and elected by the 93 general service areas in the US and Canada. We have 21 trustee delegates at the General Service Conference. We have about 15 staff from GSO and the Grapevine who get a vote at the General Service Conference. And we have 6 directors, non-trustee directors on either AA World Service or AA Grapevine. Every year, it's somewhere between 130 and 140 people, depending on staff members. So let's read through this slowly. Through our conference structure, we ought to maintain all levels of traditional right of participation. And then if you have the book in front of you, which is page 15 of the concepts, put a line up and down right after that quotes of participation, right before the word taking. So here's where, if you take the time to explain it to new people, it can make some sense. Taking care that each classification or group of our world servants, so we have 4 classifications: trustees, area delegates, staff, and directors, shall be allowed a voting representation in reasonable proportion to the responsibility they discharge. Well, why do the area delegates have 93 people, almost 70% of the voting? Well, because Bill and Bob left AA to the groups. And the reasonable proportion is that the groups should have the biggest vote at the conference. Hence, you need 2/3 of the groups of the delegates present to have the General Service Conference, but it's usually around 69, 70%. Then the next largest group is the trustees. They carry out the legal obligations of running the business of AA. They are on the other end of the spiritual agreement, the handshake with the groups, that they'll do what the groups tell them to do. And then you have the staff and the non-trustee directors. But that reasonable proportion is the important language. The groups were left in charge. And when we get to 5, especially 6, 7, and 8, we'll talk about that. But I think it would be best, since we're working with little time, if you have a question, to send it to me in the chat. I will read it to everyone else, and then I will answer it. And please don't be shy. If you're from another country, if you're from Europe, wherever, we don't have any, there are no dumb questions. Just send a question in. The first question that came in is, can a meeting have a group conscience? This is something that can be used to cause a lot of obviously, we have meetings and we have groups. So if we're talking about a meeting, not an AA group, obviously they need some structure. What kind of meeting are they? They serve coffee at their meeting? They have literature at their meeting? So you can't say arrogantly, I can't, that a meeting can't ever have a vote. But I think a meeting should take the informed group conscience process as seriously as a group does. And I don't know when that meeting would have a business meeting. But I'll tell you what can happen. If it is an AA group, I'll give you an example. And somebody walks in and it's a closed meeting, and somebody walks in and they do not meet the requirements of a closed meeting, which I'll just tell you the requirements in case you've not seen them in the AA group pamphlet. You have to be an alcoholic, or you have to have a drinking problem and a desire to stop drinking. But you ever been in a meeting where somebody comes in that's not supposed to be there and somebody's like, oh, let's have a group conscience right now? That's not a group conscience. That's like a hostile takeover. That's a everybody vote with, as the doctor's opinion would call it, frothy emotional appeal. And you know what is so sad about frothy emotional appeal in Alcoholics Anonymous? It's always unfair to the alcoholic who's struggling. Because we may have a teacher who went to that. Let's just use this example. Some 4th grade teacher who has a drinking problem decides to go to an AA meeting, and because they're really worried about their anonymity, specifically goes to a closed meeting. But yet somebody who's doesn't meet the requirements comes, And we all vote never thinking about the AA member. Always thinking about, oh yeah, let's make it an open meeting and let so-and-so's girlfriend stay or so-and-so's boyfriend stay or whatever else. Those kind of votes, those really drive me crazy. Let's see. Question, end of short form tradition 6. I'm going to ask that person to send it next week because we didn't talk about tradition 6 tonight. But please send it next week. Who decides who is an alcoholic? Great question. The individual. But I want to say this very clearly. There's kind of two requirements, or two types, I should say. If you're talking about being present at a meeting, then the individual decides if they're an alcoholic. If we're talking about taking someone through the big book, it is very clear in working with others that the person who is taking the person through the book should be convinced that the person is an alcoholic. So all these people out there who say we don't diagnose, well, I'm not going to debate diagnosing, but I do know what it says in working with others. But if someone is in a meeting, they get to admit themselves whether they're an alcoholic or not. But just saying I have a desire to stop drinking does not comply with what the group what the conference approved literature says. Attendance at a closed meeting is for alcoholics, or the second class of people is if you have a drinking problem and a desire to stop drinking. This I have a desire to stop drinking is not a magic, like, I feel like someone's at the door with a secret password. Oh, just tell them you have a desire to stop drinking. That's not a secret password in Alcoholics Anonymous. You also have to have a drinking problem. And you can have a million other problems. We just don't care what they are. Can a meeting have a representative to the local service structure? I can't speak for all 63 structures in the country, in the world. In the United States and Canada, a group has a general service representative, not a meeting. Next question. How do you define what AA is and what AA isn't? There is some great AA literature that answers those questions directly. There's one called the AA Fact File, and it answers those questions directly. Let's see. About half the meetings I have attended have decided to continue reading the old preamble. Is this wrong? You guys giving me hard questions. I'm going to give you how I honestly feel. For me personally, I think AA unity is more important. And then until it's changed, the current version should be read. However, I want to tell you why the example of unity is so important. Because a lot of groups changed the preamble before we made this last change at the conference. And now all those people are mad that other people won't read the new one. How hypocritical is that? So groups, before the conference changed it this year, not even groups, we had regional service assemblies like PRASA. They read a different preamble before we changed the preamble. And now those same people are mad that other people are reading the old one. which is why that reinforces to me more that our unity is based on our literature and our conference approved literature. And we're best just reading what is conference approved. Let's see. In terms of the fourth tradition, can my group decide to read non-conference approved literature or have a non-alcoholic speak, like, say, a respected clergy or non-alcoholic trustee? Boy, getting some really good questions tonight. Love when I'm on the firing line. Number one, what we shouldn't be doing is, if it's an AA member, we don't care if they're a doctor. We don't care if they're a counselor. We don't care if they're a professor. We don't even care if they're a witch. We don't care about any of that. An AA member should only be addressed as their name and last initial, no more, no less. Now, the questions here are, can your group use non-conference approved literature? Of course. But that goes back to, like, hanging out with me when I'm drinking. Can you and should you are very important differences when asking me a question about, can you do something or should you do something? There's a lot of things that I apparently can do that other people think you shouldn't. That's kind of the story of my whole drinking life. So you have to ask yourself that question. Is it setting the right example for the newcomer to use non-AA literature? Now, non-AA literature that goes against specifically the three things mentioned in the long form of Tradition 10, alcohol, reform, politics, or religion, those have no place in AA whatsoever. I understand some groups use a 24-hour day book. But again, it's up to your group, but I think you should keep the newcomer in mind. I want to address the last part of that question, which was about have a non-alcoholic speak, like a respected clergy or non-alcoholic trustee. I think your group can have a guest speak anytime you want, if you're having a workshop or something, but you have to clearly define that they're not an AA member. You have to clearly maybe say that what they're about to share, because they're an author who wrote some book, is their opinion. I'm not here to be some kind of draconian, person saying that you can never do this, you can never do that. You got to find a way to do it within the traditions. You got to find a way to do it in a way that doesn't harm newcomers or harm AA. I'll give you a perfect example. At a lot of group anniversaries, I'm sure, a lot of us have been to group anniversaries. And sometimes the pastor or the rabbi or whoever of the church or synagogue that we're meeting in comes to the group anniversary. And a lot of times the group will give them like 2 minutes to, and a lot of times I've seen pastors who are just so respectful, who say they're so glad that Alcoholics Anonymous meets in their meeting, in their church, and they're so glad that they have a place to send alcoholics. But how about the pastors who go over the line? What's that look like? Well, that looks like, hey, I'd love to see some of you here at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. We don't do that. That has no business in Alcoholics Anonymous. That has gone way over the line of affiliation and endorsement. Let's see. Can someone share about his drug use, saying Bill himself says in the big book he was on a mix of sedative and drink, that he was letting the newcomer know he can be there? Well, I'm going to talk about this a lot next week. It's really a tradition 5 and not tradition 3 question, but I want to give a simple answer. We don't censor what people say in meetings. Where we go too far is when we tell people that we have an answer for drug addiction all on its own. The outside issue is drug addiction, not drugs. Imagine, I'm not going to pick on anybody in this meeting, but imagine one of you was picked at a meeting, and before you got to the podium, we said, oh, by the way, you're not allowed to talk about crashing cars, drunk driving, dialing drunk in the middle of the night, depression, getting locked up, going to jail, one-night stands. I could go on and on. If we handed a list out like that, what would alcoholics talk about from the podium before they came to AA phase of their talk? No, I'm going to focus on the AA group pamphlet next week. It's when we focus on drug addiction. It's when we send the wrong message that we have an answer for drug addiction that we go too far. We have an answer for alcoholism. If some of your other problems got better because of the steps, that's great. But our answer is for alcoholism. Do past delegates or past trustees get to see copies of the new AA service manual before it goes to print? That is a good question. I can't speak for all past delegates and past trustees. What I would say, I wasn't at last year's conference, but some of the people who rotated out, who were second-year delegates last year, might have seen a draft of the new service manual last year. If you're a trustee like I was, the new service manual has been worked on for a long time, going back to like 2014. So there's lots of people that have seen draft, improvements of the service manual. But if the question is, do past trustees and past delegates get to see anything else besides the background material? That answer is no, they do not. How can Zoom meetings be integrated into the structure? That's a great question. A lot of service structures are working on that. But that's an individual question for each structure to decide. When do you give up on trying to get the group to adhere to the traditions and understand the importance of them? I know that usually they die off, but this group is getting stronger and stronger financially and further from AA. If it's not my home group, is it my problem, even if it affects AA as a whole? Wow, that is, excuse my language. That is a great question. I know of a few of these groups that look pretty strong and they seem financially strong. Obviously, if it's not your home group, you don't have a vote there. I'd love to know how they're affecting AA as a whole. Maybe next week you could send an example. But I don't think you have to stop talking about it. And unfortunately, sometimes these groups become very powerful, and other people don't want to ever say anything that could be perceived as negative about them, because then they feel like people will be coming after them. I'd love to know specifically what that group is doing, and maybe next week you could send that question with one or two examples of specifically. I can give you one that I knew of. Large, powerful group where I used to live. It was the largest speaker meeting on Saturday night. They got really big into the Recovery Bible, and the only people who could speak would talk about the Recovery Bible. Then they would have some celebrity speakers speak, who they would let sell their book or books after and sign them. That group completely vanished after about 5 years. But the pendulum swings in these groups. But again, I put my email out there. The person who asked this question, I'd love to know a couple of what real traditions they're really causing trouble with. You spoke to the difficulty of supporting a group conscience. Can you speak of the difficulty of supporting an individual's right to be non-conforming? I love nonconformists, so I plead guilty on that. I don't know what you mean by non-conforming, but I think everybody has a right to be as unique and individual as they want in Alcoholics Anonymous. That's how I read the first tradition of no conformity. I know certain meetings have a group conscience about dress code, and then it's your decision whether you want to go there or not. My problem with dress code is I have a problem with defining one culture's dress code as everyone else's culture's dress code. That I can't reconcile inside my head. I was at a conference one time, and the chair came over to me and was really upset and said, "I can't believe how the Friday night speaker dressed." And I remember saying to him, who is it? Who's the Friday night speaker? And he pointed across the room to this guy. And I remember saying to him, I said, I have to ask you, when you asked this person to speak, like, you knew he was a biker, right? Like, this is not new news. And he said, "Oh yeah, I knew he was a biker." And I remember saying to him, I said, I don't know that guy, but I'm going to guess that if you talk to him, he has on his biker dress clothes tonight to be the Friday night speaker. They might not look like the dress clothes that you call dress clothes, but that's not what matters. What matters is we don't have conformity in Alcoholics Anonymous. But I think nonconformists also serve a role. I think they're as important in the group conscience process as the person who conforms the most. Let's see. Reading AA approved literature can backfire with new members, especially when it's gendered. What does a group do then? Well, first of all, we have a group conscience process that you can go through to, if you feel the literature should be changed, I would support you writing in for that change. Before that, I would say that you might want to explain in sponsorship that the book was written in 1935. It was written in the style of reading from then. But I would more focus on, if you believe it should be changed, then you should institute an agenda item to change it. That's your right as an AA member. But I think it's our right. Here's what I keep my outside opinions outside of AA. I love the version or the vision. Anyone ever see that Kevin Costner movie when he's a rescue swimmer in the Coast Guard? Maybe I'm the only one. But anyway, he's a rescue swimmer in the Coast Guard, and he's out there in the middle of the ocean, and there's 3 people drowning off a ship. I am the type of alcoholic where when I am drowning in the ocean and the helicopter finally shows, I want to make sure the right person is throwing me the life preserver. I want to make sure the kind of person I think it should be is coming down to help me. That's the kind of people we are. And I think the beauty of Tradition 3 is the doorman on Park Avenue can sponsor the newcomer investment banker who lives in the building he's a doorman at. The beauty of Tradition 3 is at a convention in Maryland, I met 2 men, a sponsor and a sponsee. It was the only time I'd ever met this unique combination of people in Alcoholics Anonymous. The sponsor was a retired police officer who had shot the sponsee 30 years ago at a bank robbery. And after that sponsee was released from prison and got sober, they met each other at a meeting and wound up becoming sponsor and sponsee. That shit only happens in AA. So when I hear about newcomers who are offended by our literature, I look at it from 2 ways. Number one, if you're not a newcomer and you think our literature should be changed, you should send in an agenda item. But number 2, if you are working with a newcomer, you should work with them so they realize that their life can still be saved, regardless what the words in the book say, or regardless what the person reaching out their hand to help them looks like. I mean, I always talk about Midnight Madness in New York City. For some people, their spiritual hilltop is Akron, Dr. Bob's house. For other people, it's stepping stones. And for some others, it's Bill's house in Vermont. And for others, it's some type of religious or spiritual location. For me, it's a steel door at the corner of Varick and Houston Street in Greenwich Village that leads upstairs to an old after-hours bar that is the Midnight Madness group of Alcoholics Anonymous. And inside that group, on any given night, you might sit next to a fireman, a police officer, somebody in the mafia, a waitress, a waiter, a lawyer, and God knows what else. But they all help each other. And when I read these questions about our literature, I hope that those of us who were here before are taking the time to make anyone who feels excluded to feel welcome by sharing the program of Alcoholics Anonymous with them. I've been in an open AA meeting where visitors have been asked if they would like to share. Is there an official position on this in the literature? Yes, there is. In the AA group pamphlet, which we'll talk about next week, at an open meeting while everyone can attend, only alcoholics participate. That's right from the literature. At a big book meeting, should you always read from the big book, or could you change to living sober? Would that be correct? Well, I mean, in my country, most people who go to big book meetings don't even think living sober should be an AA book, to be perfectly honest. And everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But it would be hard for me to go to a meeting that's called the big book meeting that actually uses something else besides the big book. But again, this is AA, so anything is possible. I would just hope that the group conscience discussed it thoroughly before they made that decision. Right of participation, is this where one member, one group, one vote comes from? I'm really great at AA service. Why should I limit my service to only one group? Shouldn't I try to be of maximum service? Of course. I mean, isn't that what we see so many people doing? And we hear them. Isn't it worse when they say, oh, my sponsor told me I should get a commitment here? So let's talk about first voting. One vote, one group. Let's talk about service positions. You should do service at your home group. That's where you do service. Now, if you're talking about cleaning ashtrays or picking up chairs or helping out, I'm not saying don't help out at any meeting that you go to. What I am saying is you should make your home group the best group in the world. And that's where you should do your primary service in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's where you should give, I think, 75% of your contributions. Because that's where you have a vote. And that's where you can hold back your money if you want to, if you don't agree, if the group's going in a different direction. But what I would tell you is there are a lot of people in AA who don't even know that their meeting is not a home group. They have no idea. And maybe you could be the person that could pass on the legacy of the traditions to them or could help them out. A lot of people just think they should get a service position anywhere. Maybe you could be the person that could explain to them. But we have a lot of people who are sponsored by people who have no second or third legacy experience whatsoever. That's just a fact. A lot of people come to AA in my country and they had never had a drink. For example, they were using pills or drugs. And they say, I have alcoholism and I have a desire to stop drinking. What should we do about it? Well, first of all, I'm not about kicking people out of meetings. I'm just about being honest and truthful. I'm going to guess that there are some people here who have been to a big book study. I'll just ask. You don't have to use the virtual thing. You could just raise your hand. Who here has been to a big book study? Some kind of weekend workshop? Great. A lot of us. When you go to a big book study, they always say, use a dictionary. What did they say to me? They said, Billy, you make up your own definition of a lot of words. Did you know that? I guess I didn't know that. But it's useful when you get to make up your own definitions. At a big book study, they love to say, no, use a dictionary and use the 1939 dictionary that Bill used. You know what's a great word to use for that? Meditate. Meditation. In today's world, we think it's about, chanting and banging gongs and doing what else? And back in 1939, it was about thoughtful contemplation. That's what meditation was defined as. But it seems when it comes to alcoholism, we don't like the dictionary. The dictionary defines alcoholism as someone who is an alcoholic. An alcoholic is someone who drinks alcohol. Alcohol is a liquor. But again, I want to go back to, we're not talking about people who are alcoholics and everything else. And I'm going to really talk about this next week in Tradition 5. Since you travel to so many meetings and groups, have you noticed an increase in members and yet a decrease in the leg of service? Just want your personal observations. That's a very interesting question. AA really hasn't returned to what it was beforehand, before COVID. Still a lot of conferences and conventions not happening, still some meetings meeting in Zoom, still some people choosing not to go. I've seen good and bad from the AA Zoom world. The traditions and concepts in the big book have gotten to places it would have never gotten before. But now we have people who say things like, this is my Zoom home group. What the hell does that mean? Is that like different than a home group? Or does that mean that we now, I just haven't seen the literature yet, mean that we're supposed to have a Zoom home group and a regular home group? I've also seen a lot of groups that seem to be addicted to out-of-town speakers. So they don't want to go live, or they want to stay hybrid because they want to bring in supposedly good speakers. And I believe that there is some real benefit to this technology. But I also believe AA was meant to be very local. And I also believe that whether you're a newcomer who needs help, or whether you're 20 years sober and just had the police at the door and told you that your child was just killed in an accident, that you need a local AA community surrounding you, and you need them close by. And so it's going to be very interesting to see if there is a decrease in the legacy of service. I think we're going to have to see how we're going to let online groups, and I say groups, not meetings, participate in the service structure. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, with more people who are introduced to AA kind of outside the village. So I don't think I've seen enough yet to be able to compare pre-COVID AA and post-COVID AA. Anybody have any more questions? We're going to end very soon. We have brought people who are homebound and had lost a active service again. That's the benefit. Of course, no one's arguing with that. I would tell you that we failed as miserably as an organization. We should have been using this for the homebound and people in correctional facilities and lots of people. I've seen lots of elderly people who their lives, their lights have come on like a newcomer who's been through the steps. Shame on us for not doing that. I am all for embracing. What I am not for is using it as an excuse not to be a member of local AA. If I'm a GSR at my home group, is it okay that I'm also on H&I, Bridging the Gap, and PI for district? and I'm a special worker at my central office. Area is voting soon, and they want me to be involved at area level. Do you think it is okay? So first of all, for those that are not from America or not from the West Coast, H&I is hospitals and institution. And in California, I'm guessing this person is from California or somewhere on the West Coast. Hospitals and institution has been separate from general service. I'm personally one of the general service people who believe that H&I does a better job than general service does at it. So I don't think there's anything wrong with being a GSR and doing H&I. Doing PI for the district, I don't know what position you hold. And as far as being a special worker at the office, I mean, I think you got to judge how much can you do, and is there a conflict with what you do? And if you think there's a conflict between one position and another, then I would not do it. But I don't think there's a problem with doing H&I and also being a special worker. You know, for special workers, you know, most people in the US and Canada don't understand. That's not service. That's your job. That's where you make money. That's what you're paid to do. I'm sure lots of people like to say to special workers, thanks for your service. At the general service office, they always say, oh no, this isn't my job. This isn't service. This is my job. So what I would say about you being a special worker is like me working in the insurance industry. I should be able to do H&I work. Your job shouldn't prevent you from doing service in your AA service life. They should just be separate. Can you speak to the idea we've lost older members over time? Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things have happened. I think Zoom is helping with that. I also think that older members came in at a time when the home group was more important. And I don't know what older means chronologically or by sobriety. But I see a lot of older members, elderly, in meetings now. I was just with a bunch of guys that are sober a long time, and you know, if we let the inmates run the asylum, like, it's fine to have a group conscience, but it's different when you're letting the inmates run the asylum. Those two are not necessarily the same thing. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to keep AA. And when you talk to a lot of these people who've left meetings that are still sober a long time, they say because it doesn't look like the AA they came into. Now, do they have to change with time? Of course. Do you have to adapt with time? Of course. But I'm going to really enjoy talking about Tradition 5 next week. All right, last two questions. If the secretary chairperson doesn't follow the script or other rules decided by the group conscience, can other members present at the meeting intervene? If yes, what about the we trust our trusted servants rule? Well, that's kind of bullshit, the trust our trusted servants rule. We trust but verify. You don't just blindly trust. That's crazy. Trust but verify. I wouldn't interrupt during a meeting, but at the next group conscience, you should remove that trusted servant. Now, if it's so crazy and off the wall, maybe you intervene. But if all they're doing is changing the script, then all you need to do is change the trusted servant. I attend an online home group, but the members all live here. That's great. We might see some more of that. I mean, the elderly that couldn't get out physically. Oh yeah, we owe it to them. Here's what breaks my heart. January the 1st, 2020 is not even 2 years away. It's not even 2 years ago. If you went to the major intergroup central office websites in the United States and Canada, and you were elderly, you could not find an online meeting. You'd have to go to the online intergroup website, because we live in fear and we hate anything new, and we have all these rigid rules. And somebody just asked me a meeting. Have I ever walked out of a meeting? Yes. I try really never ever to do that. I will tell you that the last time I walked out of a meeting, and then I'm going to tell one story and then we're ending this. The last time I walked out of a meeting was because there was a female speaker from Southern California who has a history of getting graphically not telling her story in a general way at the podium, and a bunch of women felt very disrespected and got up and walked out, and eventually a bunch of us walked out. That's the last time I walked out of a meeting. To the person who asked this question about the elderly and everything, I want to share why I feel so strongly about us using this technology. And I've told this story before, but some of you have not heard it. But about 3 weeks before my mother died in 2000, I went to the hospice she was in to visit her. And if you've not heard me tell this story, I admit that I can be shallow or uncultured or, make rash judgments in my head. And when I walked into her hospice room, there was a woman doing her nails. And the first thing I thought about in my head to myself was, can't this lady see what my mother looks like? She's like 70 pounds and is going to die any day. Why is she doing her nails? And a couple hours later, a nurse that I knew, my mother's nurse, came in the room. And I asked her a question. I said, why was that lady doing my mother's nails? And the nurse said to me, Billy, a couple of weeks ago when your mother was still conscious, I was talking to her, and she told me that no matter how bad her life ever got, she could always look down at her nails. It was the one thing that always gave her a sense of joy and pride. And believe me, I tried to wreck her life, and my dad did millions of times. And she said, so I saw your mother's nails yesterday, and I decided to call the nail technician because that's what your mom would want her nails to look like today. So the reason I tell you that story is, what about people in America and all over the world who are in a hospice and still conscious, and all they want to do, they don't want their nails done, but they just want to go to one last AA meeting. They just want to check in with the fellowship that saved their life. Like, it breaks my heart that just 2 years ago, we hadn't harnessed this technology. Now, I know people have been meeting online forever, but regular AA, they were so against anything technology. And so I'm glad that this is here now. I am, really glad that we are harnessing it. And I'll give you another fact. Over 300 correctional facilities were on lockdown on January the 1st of 2020. That's just the US and Canada. That means that they were restricting visitors, and for most of them, not allowing volunteers in, including AA volunteers. How is it possible that we're not harnessing this technology to bring AA into correctional facilities that are in lockdown And in certain states, large states, New York, Texas, California, we have facilities that have been in lockdown for months, some over a year, because of staffing shortages and COVID and everything else. So there's lots, the elderly and a lot of other people, I hope that we never forget about using this. One of my heroes, Tom I, always had a saying, and he always said, when God has work to do, the walls come down. Well, this technology has taken down a lot of walls. So, Sydney, I am calling it quits there. We had so many questions, but we will be back next week